Hi there, I'm Isabel Lawrence, and welcome to the Money Magpie podcast. This is my first ever podcast, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Nim Siriwardana, co-founder of Metacask. Nim, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. Metacask
Thanks,
is
Ben.
Thank you. Yeah, Metacask is an online platform for buying and selling investor grade spirits. And what is fascinating is that each spirit is sold with an NFT as proof of purchase, so it can be traded on the blockchain. Now, if terms like NFT and blockchain seem unfamiliar to you, or like me, you've heard of them, but you aren't quite sure what it all means, stick around to find out more. And I'm sure Nim will let us know what we need to know. So let's talk Metacask. As I mentioned at the start, it's an online platform for buying and selling investor grade spirits. Nim, what makes spirits such valuable collectibles?
Um, Hi, hi, guys. Thanks for having us on. Um, I mean, interestingly, whiskey as a collectible has been a space for a while, right? People actually buy everything from barrels to bottles. Barrels primarily because over time, as the whiskey matures in the barrel, the value of the whiskey is seen to increase, right? And so historically, people have seen this as a good opportunity to almost park some money in an asset where you don't really have to do too much. You just let it mature, right? And then eventually, after a period of time, potentially there is some upside because this thing is valuable, due to its age, right? So for barrels, that's always been the case, right? Bottles is more of an interesting thing in the sense that some of the more rarer stuff tends to be more expensive. So there's definitely a price appreciation if you find the right kind of bottle, right? So just to give you an example, there was a collection of Japanese whiskey bottles from a distillery that was closed down, right? And it was released almost as a collection of carded decks. Sorry, a deck of cards, right? So you have, let's say, 52 cards, and there were 52 bottles each with its own card, right? And in each collection, there was maybe, say, 600 bottles. Now, initially, when it was released, people were like, well, okay, it's a gimmick, right? But now, if you actually have the full collection, it's actually worth quite a lot, right? And so people are going around trying to collect, for example, the individual cards to put an entire collection together. But as you can imagine, over time, only a limited, releases of these bottles were made, and so as a result, they are becoming more and more rarer, right? And so, if you find the right kind of bottle, for sure, as time proceeds, that the number of those bottles available sort of decreases, and you get this kind of rarity factor kicking in, and hence you see a price appreciation. Now, this is not going to happen with every single bottle that you buy, unfortunately, right? But if you find the right kind, and there are other people like-minded who like that particular kind of whiskey, it can certainly happen. Sure.
Great. So it's kind of like, infinite goods, finite goods, sorry, like gold and silver. The less you have of something, the more valuable it becomes. And I guess that's sort of similar to whiskey.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's like any collectible. I mean, if you collected like Star Wars figurines back in the 70s when it originally came out, right? Those original Star Wars figurines are worth a lot more than, let's say, what you have right now, because obviously right now there's like mass scale production and there's a lot of them, right? Luckily in the whiskey space, yes, you have mass scale production. If you go to a standard supermarket and buy a bottle of Jameson, it's not necessarily going to be worth, a significant amount down the line, right? But if you do find the right bottle from a right limited collection, for sure that can be worth a bit more down the line because obviously the number of those bottles really have decreased, right? One of the interesting aspects of whiskey is that once it goes into the bottle, it doesn't mature anymore, right? So unlike wine. So if you have a 12-year-old, 15-year-old, 18-year-old whiskey, that stays 12, 15, 18 years. It doesn't matter how old the bottle is, right? So, the bottle could be 100 years old. It's still 12-year-old whiskey because that's what it was bottled as, right? But interestingly, the value will be because, well, it's a 100-year-old bottle of 12-year-old whiskey, right? From way back when, right? Because there are not going to be that many of those around. Yeah. So it really is about rarity, and it really is about how long you typically hold these things, right? And obviously what the general market thinks of that particular release as well. Right?
Great. And Metacast gives digital ownership of physical assets. Do people have access to the physical version of these assets?
Yes, if it didn't, if they didn't, we would have problems, right? No, basically the idea with what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring the concept of digital twins. So everything you buy has effectively a digital counterpart, which we record on the blockchain, right? What's the value of this counterpart? Well, the whole idea behind this is it can be used to authenticate to verify what you actually bought, right? So think of it like a mechanism for preventing counterfeiting, right? In the sense that when you buy that bottle of whiskey, for example, you can tap on some sort of, QR code, NFC, whatever it is that's on the bottle, and it'll take you to the token on chain, which allows you to verify, well, that's actually the original token. It came from the original producer. This thing is a legitimate product, right? But basically, that's that one scenario where you've actually got the physical bottle. But there's other scenario where, for example, the actual underlying physical product would be in storage, right? So let's say we take the barrel, for example, right? You can't have a barrel of, whiskey from Scotland delivered to your house, right? Just because you own it. It doesn't work like that. So the whiskey has to stay up in Scotland while it's maturing, right? Now, in this instance, when you buy a barrel of whiskey, what you get is effectively a letter saying you own that thing, right? But you don't really have physical access to it. You can go to the warehouse and have a look, right? But the reality is you can't take it home with you. Now, what we do is we say, well, instead of the paper letter, you actually get this digital token, the NFT, which you can actually use to say, this is mine, right? And you can claim the underlying barrel. When you claim the underlying barrel, typically what happens is you have it bottled and you ship all the bottles to your house, for example, right? But it basically gives you that mechanism to prove you own that physical thing. The physical thing is yours, right? And you've got call to it, and you can claim it anytime you want, right? But basically, the ownership is represented digitally.
Okay, great. So sort of like a receipt, just to, keep it in
Exactly,
your and
exactly. It's a long-lasting receipt, right? That you're not going to really lose.
yeah. And whiskey's having a resurgence in popularity amongst young people in particular, which is quite interesting. What advice would you give to someone looking to buy whiskey for the first time and sort of get it as a collectible?
I think the first step should be really trying it out and tasting and see what you actually like, right? Just going out there buying random bottles is not really gonna, probably be the right approach if you're going to go out and try and invest in these things or actually, acquire them as collectibles, right? Firstly, just develop a taste for it. Figure out, what kind of whiskey you like, right? And once you figure out what kind of whiskey you like, it actually makes your decisions in terms of, what you're going to collect a lot easier because effectively what you're going to be collecting stuff that you'll drink anyway, right? And so, let's say down the line, there's no increase in value, at least you can drink it because you like it, right? So that's probably a good starting point, right? So firstly, develop the taste to figure out what you really like. The other option is to obviously read, there's a lot of output from experts in the industry who typically say these bottles are, going through a certain period of, let's say, resurgence. People like these kinds of things. They collect these things, right? And you can have a look at them. I certainly wouldn't go down and put like £225,000 and buy the most expensive bottle of whiskey, for example, right? I mean, you can if you want, but the point is that, there's actually collectibles in all price ranges, right? So figure out what your budget is, how much you want to invest or put aside in these things, right? And then typically what I would do is I would have a look at like what's the market for sub £1,000, sub £500 bottles, right? And see how the popularity of those bottles have changed over time. Now, unfortunately, there's quite a bit of market data, but it's actually not easily accessible. So you can't really go out and figure out precisely how has the price of this specific, bottle changed, right? But you can kind of see there's some trends for some similar types of bottles, right? And so based on those kinds of trends, you can see, well, is this type of whiskey slightly underpriced or overpriced, right? But it's really all about doing a little bit more research. But I think it all starts with really trying to understand what you like and collecting from what you like is probably more sensible than just going out and buying the first 200 or 300 pound bottle of whiskey that you come across. Right?
Yeah, so sort of take your time with it, do a bit of research. Don't
Yeah.
just jump in, shove all your money at one thing before you kind of know.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
No, 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 no. I would. I mean, it's like any sort of let's say, I hate to use the word investment, but any sort of investment you make in the traditional world, right? If you're going to invest in equities or bonds or whatever it is, right? You're going to go and do some research. You're going to have a look at, am I going to really invest in this company by buy shares, for example, right? You're not just going to say, well, I like the sound of company A because it has a cool name. I'm just going to buy that. That's not the kind of thing you do, right? You do some research. So obviously doing research is part of the puzzle, right? You got to figure out, okay, is this something that I'm gonna like? But I think if you can start off by tasting it, you really like that particular type of whiskey from that particular type of distillery, right? Then that's a good starting point. Yeah. And it might be that, it is a popular whiskey and there's a lot of people who are likewise, who like that particular collection, right? And if they do, then it makes even more sense because you know that there's actually a group of people that actually like that whiskey, right? Um, Now, the reality is that there is a limited set of whiskey. So obviously finding, stuff that other people like is going to be pretty common. But the reality is that even within that limited space, there are so many different subtleties and so many different varieties, so many different types of collections, how flavor is done in these whiskeys. And so trying to find that right one, I think is the starting point, right? And so once you discover it, then it's like, okay, just have at it. Find the bottles that you like and just keep collecting. And don't start by buying 10,000, 50,000 bottles. Just start on the low end and see how it goes. Develop some experience. And once you've got that, then you start, expanding. Right?
Yeah, that's good advice. And I'm just going to go back to NFTs because I think, as you said, you give customers an NFT as a proof of purchase. What exactly is an NFT?
So the easiest way to imagine, actually, I think you need to take a step back further, right, and think about blockchain. What is actually a blockchain, right? The analogy that I use for blockchain is to think of it like a giant spreadsheet, right? And it's a giant spreadsheet that anybody in the world can effectively write to, right? Now, in that kind of scenario, you can imagine it'll get into a mess very quickly because everybody writes a row into the spreadsheet, everybody updates stuff in the spreadsheet, and it becomes a giant mess very quickly, right? What blockchain does is it actually introduces, let's say, a sequence or an ordering, a kind of uh, a way of clearing up the chaos that could happen if people started writing to the spreadsheet just willy-nilly, right? And so you, as somebody who has access to the spreadsheet, could go in there and create a row, and what the system will ensure is that when the next person writes a row, it doesn't overwrite your one, it doesn't delete your one, for example, right? And it maintains a nice ordering in this ledger. So what you have is really a very concise, well-ordered ledger of effectively changes that people are making, right? So every time you put a new row in the spreadsheet, it gets added to this ledger, right? In a nice, clean way that stops you from destroying everything else, right? That came before, right? Same with me. I can add an entry and make sure that it's ordered in the right way and it doesn't destroy what came before it. So this blockchain concept is super important to understand, right? But just think of it like this giant spreadsheet where everyone's just writing rows in a nice orderly way. Now, when you take that sort of analogy into consideration, an NFT is simply just another row in that spreadsheet, right? What it says is here is something that has some data associated with it. So now there's columns of data in the spreadsheet, right? The difference is this particular entry effectively stores some information that we wanted to store, right? And what we do is we basically store all the information about the physical product in that particular row in the spreadsheet. So the physical product could be a bottle of whiskey, it could be a barrel, but we put all of the information into the spreadsheet. So we say it's this bottle number whatever, it's this barrel number whatever, right? It's whiskey from the Macallan. It's so number of years old. It's stored at this particular warehouse. We put all this information into this row in the spreadsheet. So an NFT really is just that row in the spreadsheet. But the difference is with digital ownership is you actually own that, meaning that you control this particular row. Nobody else can do anything to that particular row, only you can. When you sell it to somebody else, then they control that row. Nobody else can do anything else to it, right? And so that's what the blockchain guarantees. It maintains that spreadsheet in a structured and ordered way, where each person can own effectively a single row in that spreadsheet, and that row is whatever we want it to be. But in our case, we put the information about the actual product that you own in there.
Okay, interesting. And do you have any advice for beginners on how to do this safely? So to buy and collect spirits in a safe way. Obviously, you gave a bit of information about where to start and where to begin. But how can people ensure that they are getting what they pay for? How to avoid sort of maybe scams in this way? Is there anything they should look out for?
Sure. So there's two types of, let's say, products that you can invest in or collect in whiskey, right? So obviously there's bottles and barrels, as I mentioned. The way you do these are somewhat different, right? Now there are these brokers that you can go to. So for example, our partner VCL Vintners, they're a broker who deals specifically with barrel sales, right? And so you can go to them and say, I want to buy a barrel of whiskey, for example, and they'll take you through the process and they'll guide you and they'll help you select the right one, and you can do that, right? And they can also certainly do bottles as well, but the reality is that they're mainly focused on barrels. So you have a lot of these brokers who will actually sell you these barrels, right? So that's one route. Now, when you go through a broker, typically there's two types of or two bits of paperwork that you can get, right? One is what most brokers call a proof of ownership certificate. Is a piece of paper that says you own this barrel, right? Now, in that scenario, still a bit of a risk, so you should make sure that you do some due diligence on the broker to ensure that that proof of ownership certificate is actually going to be legitimate in the case the broker goes away, right? And so companies like VCL, they spend some time, they put the right structures in place in the event that VCL isn't there, for example. The proof of ownership certificate is still legitimate and you can claim the underlying product. Now, that's why companies like Metacask come in because we give you the NFT, which is a more robust mechanism for the same sort of thing, like owning the same thing, right? So that's one route, go through the brokers. The second way of owning it is the delivery order. So if you go to a warehouse you go to a distillery or you go to a broker and you buy a barrel, get the delivery order. If you get the delivery order, that's like the ultimate proof of ownership in the UK, right? And that says I actually own this thing. So if you have a delivery order in your hand, it's yours, right? Nobody can take anything. There's no question about it at all. Even if the person who sold it goes away, it doesn't matter. You own it. You own that barrel in your name at the warehouse, right? So that's one thing that you can do to ensure that you've got like full ownership of the underlying product. As I said, the delivery orders tend to be sort of rarer. Proof of ownership certificates tend to be more common, primarily because a lot of the warehouses where this stuff is stored, they don't really like having individual users as account holders in the warehouses, right? It makes it more complicated for them. If you imagine, they're storing like tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of these barrels up there, right? And so if there's like thousands of users that own these things, it's a real nightmare for them to track the eventual end ownership, right? And so they much prefer like a broker who has like, let's say 10,000 barrels under their name, and then the broker manages the actual ownership of the individual users, right? But that's why I said where there's that problem where if the broker goes away, you better hope that the records are good, that you can actually go and get that barrel, right? So that's why it's important that you go with a legitimate broker when you go into the cask investment space, right? Obviously, if you buy on a platform like Metacask, you're getting an NFT, and then you've got proof of ownership, already on the blockchain. So that's kind of almost replacing the delivery order and the proof of ownership mechanism, right? With the bottles, you have brokers as well. So there are brokers that you can go to, but you really only go to the brokers if you really want high-end bottles or rare stuff that maybe isn't available on the market, right? Typically, if you're going to buy legitimate bottles, I would go to a legitimate source. So obviously, Metacast we sell stuff as well, but you have places like Whiskey Hammer or Whiskey Exchange, right? These are well-established sites that are actually selling hard to find, perhaps maybe some of the rarer bottles, right? And so when you buy from them, you know that they've done the work already to verify the particular bottle, make sure it's legitimate before they sell it on the platform. Right? There'll be a few more of these types of platforms coming up, and they'll offer like NFT type mechanism as well, right? But Metacast, for example, we focus just on new collections, which are coming directly from distilleries and from brands, right? And so we don't have a secondary marketplace for bottles just yet. And so if you want to buy the rarer stuff, I'd say the existing, those types of venues that I mentioned, like Whiskey Exchange, Auction, Whiskey Auction, they're the kinds of places where you can go to get legitimate stuff, right? Now, having said all of that, when you do buy that particular bottle and it comes home, right, it's important to check it out, right? Because there are cases where people basically buy these bottles and find out actually it's been filled with some low grade whiskey, right? Because somebody opened it and then just put the seal back on again and sent it out, right? And so this is a fairly prevalent problem in the space, right? And so do be careful with buying from places like eBay or whatever, because if you go there, the likelihood of finding a counterfeit product is going to be very high, right? And so stick to legitimate sources if you're going to buy secondary like markets, bottles on the secondary market, right? Otherwise, you could end up in that scenario, for sure.
Yeah, so yeah, stick with legitimate sources. If it's a random seller somewhere, try and avoid if you can. Just keep
Yes.
yourself safe. Great. And is there anything exciting coming up for Metacask? I know you've got a few exciting partnerships and things going on at the moment.
We do. So we have a couple of partnerships that are coming up. Unfortunately, I can't talk about anything at the moment. But basically, I think one thing that I can definitely say is that one of the questions you asked in slightly earlier was how do we make it easier, right? And actually, this is one of the things that we're doing with our marketplace as well. So unlike a lot of the other NFT type marketplaces, we're basically moving in a direction which makes it easier to onboard onto the platform. So these days, when you want to buy something on Metacast, when you go to the website, you typically only need your address, for example, to register an account and set up, right?
Yeah.
And when you use that email address, you actually get behind the scenes an account created on the blockchain for you, and it's managed by your email address, right? Meaning that you actually don't have to worry about, oh, my private keys and secret phrases and all these other really complex sounding terms that you hear, right? It's all managed behind the scenes for you. And so we're trying to make it as easy as possible and as accessible as possible for people who aren't necessarily familiar with blockchain right now, right? The goal is eventually over time that basically, people may learn about the underlying technology, and then you can actually start downloading the keys and managing your own accounts, right? But until we get to that point, we have to try to make it as easy as possible.
Yeah, that's good because I think people like myself who have never done something like this before um, wouldn't know the first thing about getting on the blockchain. So I think it's really great that you make that easier for people and can introduce people into this world in a more streamlined way.
Yeah,
Um,
it's more gradual approach, right? Rather than just dropping you in it and saying, well, go figure it out, right?
yeah,
And
exactly.
plus, we'll do things like credit card payments and so on as well. So, you won't need crypto to buy any of this NFT stuff, right? I mean, it just becomes like a standard e-commerce process, like going to Amazon and buying something is exactly the same thing, experience that we're trying to bring to the site, right? So, if you're buying a barrel or a bottle or whatever it is, process is the same. You go there and you say, I'm going to pay credit card. Well, I'll pay with credit card, and once the payment's done, you get the NFT delivered into your account. Right? And after that, you can do whatever you want with it.
Great. Well, Nim, thank you so much for your time today. I've been Isabel Lawrence chatting to Nim Siriwardana, co-founder of Metacast, the online platform that allows you to buy and sell investor-grade spirits. Please note, nothing that's been said in this podcast should be taken as financial advice, and the buying and selling of goods should be done at your own risk. For more information, you can go to metacast.com or head over to moneymagpie.com for more information. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Isabel. Thanks for having us on.